We've just wrapped up a 5-part series on the Mafia and a corresponding 2-part series on Jack Ruby. Today we're focused on the Mafia episodes and we'll be diving into Ruby next week. But this is the 17th edition of Recap and Rebuttals, and we're going to go deep on the 5 Mafia episodes just to try to get an understanding of the role of organized crime in the assassination of President Kennedy. We have a very special guest with us today. Author, speaker, television producer, organized crime expert, and former associate of the Gambino crime family, Lou Ferrante. Coming up next on Solving JFK.
In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. The flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
I don't know what this is all about.
Dallas police this morning resumed questioning the man they have formally charged with the assassination of President Kennedy.
I'm just a patsy.
The man is Lee Oswald.
Was Oswald acting alone, or was he a member of a conspiracy? The mission answers, he acted alone.
I'm working I'm just a patsy.
We're joined today by Lou Ferrante, an internationally best-selling author, television producer, and organized crime expert. Lou acquired that expertise up close and personal as an associate of Mafia boss John Gotti. When Lou faced charges for heists and hijackings, he did not inform on any of his former Gambino crime family associates. Lou used his time in prison to soak up as many books as he could and to teach himself the law, and he was even able to successfully appeal one of his convictions as his own attorney. Pretty awesome. Upon his release from prison, Lou began a prolific career as an author, penning some outstanding books on organized crime, including a 3-volume history of the American Mafia called Borgata, Unlocked: The Life and Crimes of a Mafia Insider, and Mob Rules: What the Mafia Can Teach the Legitimate Businessman. As I was trying to find a suitable guest for the recap and rebuttals for the Mafia episodes, Lou's name kept coming up, and I reached out, and he's willing to come on the show today, and he's the perfect guest for this episode. So, Lou Ferrante, welcome to Solving JFK. It's an honor to have you on.
Hey, thanks, Matt. I'm happy to be here. Just a quick correction. I was close with Peter Gotti, who was John's brother. I was in and out of his house and his nephew's house, and also John's nephews, Richie, Joey. So just wanted to make sure that's clear. Yeah, but that said, everything else, thank you. I'm flattered.
Yeah, and it's almost like you can't believe the things that are on Wikipedia or the internet sometimes, you know?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I was around the whole Gotti family, but just specifically close with John's family, John's brother and his nephew.
I guess before we get into the JFK assassination specifics on the Mafia, out of the gate, you have the perspective of both someone who's studied the history, but also someone who's lived the life. What was the experience like of writing this the series on the history of the American Mafia, given your actual life experience, and how much of it of you writing these Mafia books were things that you're researching versus things that you just sort of learned and soaked up?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. When I taught myself how to write in prison, I wanted to write anything but true crime. So I desperately tried to break into other genres. And whenever I would approach a publisher or an agent, they always said, you need to tell us true crime because of your life. I've been a criminal since I'm 13, maybe even 12. And till I am 33, when I came home from prison, 13 to 33, 20 years, the largest chunk of my life, my entire adult life, I'm a criminal. So they want you to always keep pressing you, write about crime. And I didn't want to. But I have to admit that they are right to the extent that this is what I know. And when I started to research the mob, I realized that my life experiences would come to the forefront so many times where I could see if something's not right. If I read something, so-and-so, Albert Anastasia and Vito Genovese were arguing about such and such. If it makes sense to me, no bell rings in my head. Nothing goes off. No, but if I smell something that's off, I would immediately sense it because of my past. So that's sort of, and I was indicted 3 times. So obviously I studied the law. I've been in courtrooms for years. So I know a lot of the different aspects around the criminal world too. And on this side of my life, I've befriended law enforcement officers, obviously retired FBI agents. So I've kind of learned that side of the spectrum as well. So I will admit that the publishers and the agents who pushed me constantly to write true crime had it right. It is what I know. It's just something that I wanted to get away from. You know, you come home from the penitentiary after so many years and you just want to wash that stuff off you and never look back. And you know, I'm constantly forced to look back, but it is what I know. So that said, the JFK thing was an experience of its own. So when I started writing the Borgata trilogy, I really didn't know I was going to dedicate so much time and research to JFK. But I'm reading and I see that the mob was involved, not the sole conspirators. Obviously, there were members of rogue members of the government who were involved. I believe rogue members of the CIA. I also believe rogue members of the Secret Service. And I believe J. Edgar Hoover looked the other way. Although he wasn't directly involved, I believe a lot of information passed across his desk prior to the assassination that he ignored for want of something to happen to Kennedy, who was becoming more and more of an enemy to him. So I did also see, though, that the mafia played a large role in the conspiracy on the ground. And I could not then, once you see that, it's hard to say, oh, well, I'm just going to leave that out and skip over it. You're putting a president in the Oval Office and you're taking him out. This is a big deal. And that's a big deal in mafia history, and it overlaps with American history. And that was just something that was too, I guess, like enticing, you know, for anybody, especially me as a researcher and historian, to pass up. So I dove into it, and I never realized how many rabbit holes I would be going down for years. You know, the trilogy in its entirety will have taken me over 10 years once the 3rd volume is out. Volumes 1 and 2 are already published. They're doing well, thank God. Volume 3 will be out next year, and it'll have taken me over 10 years by the time it's out. A large chunk of that was me diving deeper and deeper into the Kennedy assassination, because the literature on it is just endless. And the documents that have been exposed over the years through Freedom of Information Acts, through mistakes, through witnesses who saw, seen, heard, it's incredible. So that's sort of, I brought everything to bear and pushed it all into these books, and especially the JFK event.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that. So let's go ahead and jump into, so just zooming out here. This is a recap and rebuttals episode, so I'm not going to literally restate everything we covered over 2.5 hours of content, 3 hours of content. But if you're someone watching this wondering, where am I getting this from? The transcripts and the citations are all on the website, solvingjfkpodcast.com. We're just going to touch on some of the big picture things we covered. And then Lou, I'd love to get your thoughts on these things as we go.
Yeah, Matt, on that note, I should add too, if anyone reads the 2nd volume of my Borgata trilogy, which is subtitled Clash of Titans, the reference notes are all in the back. So my theories are based directly on evidence, and I cite that evidence in the back of the book. So anybody who's really interested in digging deep into the JFK assassination, the references are there. You can draw your own conclusions. If you agree with me, great. If you have, if you diverge at certain points, but the references are there just as you cite.
Yeah, and I'll just to let the audience know as well. In watching I haven't read your book yet, although I'm going to order both of them as soon as we're done with this interview here. But in listening to you talk, everything you're saying confirms and overlaps with what we've covered on the podcast. So you're really not out. I mean, what inference you ultimately draw, sort of all these, some things are up for debate, but like the substantive facts that you've laid out are all consistent with kind of what we've covered. So that's one thing. Every now and then you'll get people who are just kind of like all over the place on things, but I do appreciate that you're committed to citations and objective truth. So that's good. All right. So history of the American Mafia, that goes way, 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 way back. We're going to zoom forward into the future for our purposes to 1957. and the Apalachin raid. So obviously this is post, so you had Prohibition, Mafia got huge. That's a whole sub conversation. And then, and a good point that I heard you make on the podcast is people's perspective on the mob kind of changed during Prohibition because they were like, hey, these are the guys that are running the speakeasies, giving us booze. Like, what's wrong with them? They're fine. You know what I mean? So,
Mhm.
but anyway, so as the mafia grew, they became, more sophisticated, and eventually and began to work together, different families, and this led to the 1950s to a meeting in 1957 in Apalachin, New York. There was a suspicious New York State police sergeant who then broke up this meeting, and it turns out to be a meeting of major mafia bosses from across the country. And then that led to the FBI really ramping up enforcement, and coincided with the McClellan Committee, which as it's relevant to the Kennedy assassination, this is where, John's a senator on the committee, but Bobby is the chief counsel and he's the bulldog. And the whole point of the committee is to pursue rackets and labor racketeering, basically. Bobby's just 31 years old at this time. He gave 8,000 witness subpoenas and had 253 active investigations during a Senate committee. Okay, then he wrote this book, The Enemy Within, calling the mafia the enemy within. Of course, when he became attorney general, later he made a list of 80 bosses and mafia figures to investigate and pursued some more aggressively than others. So I say all that to say the framing of the Kennedy administration's relationship with the mafia at large, not specific bosses, RFK came in a little hot out of the gate, and he always was. So they kind of, we'll talk about the election of 1960 here in just a second, but they kind of should have known what to expect from Bobby given his role in the McClellan Committee. Your thoughts on that?
They did know what to expect, but they were persuaded by a couple of different people and for a couple of different reasons that the Kennedys would eventually get into the Oval Office and refrain from their pursuit of the mob. And the reason why they believe that is because if you go back throughout the history, and I cover this in books 1 and 2, they originally had Thomas Dewey, who became the governor of New York and ran for president against FDR. They originally had him coming after them with everything he had in New York, putting away everybody he could, going after the mob. That was his claim to fame. And it got him to the height of someone who became the governor of New York and ran against one of the most popular presidents in the history of this country, FDR. Yeah. So Thomas Dewey then eventually, though, did get into office. Once he got into the governor's mansion, he refrained from chasing the mob. He gave Luciano, who had been convicted by Dewey, he gave him amnesty and deported him. So he was a lot easier on the mob. And then he even tried to sort of like give them a wink, and he was accused of taking campaign contributions from them later on. So he made a name for himself. Whether that was true or not, we don't know, but he was accused of it. He made a name for himself and moved on. Then you have Senator Estes Kefauver, who also did the same. During the Kefauver Committee, he ran around the country. He went after all these mobsters. He hated them. Then he ran for the Democratic nomination for president, and he forgot about the mob. He used them as a stepping stone. So the mob was convinced by Frank Sinatra and others, including Joe Kennedy, who had business dealings with mafia members, who I lay out in the book through testimony, people who dealt with him. And this testimony doesn't just come from mobsters who were shooting it out going, oh yeah, I knew Joe Kennedy. This comes from people who were around the Kennedys, who were on that side of the law, on the good side, saying, yeah, Joe knew the mob. Jack Kennedy had appointed judge, said, yeah, of course he knew the mob. That's a judge. This is a federal judge that Kennedy appointed, who's saying Joe Kennedy knew the mob and did business with the mob. So he went to them, Joe Kennedy did, and Frank Sinatra, and maybe others as well. And they convinced the mob, hey, look, I know Bobby was a real, pain in the behind during the McClellan Committee hearings, but once Jack gets in the office, we're done. We want the White House. We're going to move on. We've got civil rights problems in this country. We've got a Cold War. We've got nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. We've got bigger fish to fry. We're not going to bother with the mob. We're going to move on. So the mob was convinced that they were going to have at least 4, if not 8, easy years under the Kennedys. And they already had Hoover sort of like looking the other way or at all times, which I go deep into in volumes 1 and 2. I explain, in my opinion, based on evidence, why Hoover looked the other way. And it's not what a lot of people have heard. There have been rumors that the mob had him pictures of him cross-dressing. The mob had compromising pictures of him with Clyde Tolson, his assistant director, and they were both alleged to be homosexuals. All of that may or may not have been true. I believe it was rumor, and I believe there were other reasons, and I point out why Hoover would have looked the other way. And it goes much deeper than a picture of Hoover possibly drag queening. So again, I would urge your listeners to read the books. You'll see it in there. But getting back to the Kennedys, the mob was convinced that the Kennedys were going to look the other way, and they had every reason to put them in office. Having said that, most of the mob signed on and began to funnel campaign contributions into the Kennedy campaign, which Bobby was the head of the campaign, by the way, for Jack's run for president. And they were in desperate need of funding, the Kennedys were, during the West Virginia primary. And they needed that funding to keep coming. Even in Illinois, where Chicago ran the state, they promised to deliver the state. Chicago mob did. So there were bosses, however, even though the Chicago mob signed on and the New York mob signed on. There were bosses like Carlos Marcello from Louisiana and Santo Trafficante from Florida who said, I don't believe that. I'm not buying into that. Kennedy's going to be nice crap. We're not friends with him. He's not friends with us. We're going for Nixon. And they pushed money toward Nixon. And this is interesting, and I point this out in the book. When Jack got into the Oval Office and Bobby was appointed Attorney General, when he drew up this hit list of mobsters to go after, he had a special hatred for 2 mobsters, Marcello and Trafficante. And it just happened to be the 2 that did not back his brother. And Bobby was known for holding grudges and looking to destroy anybody, including Lyndon Johnson, who during the Democratic primary campaign was nasty with the Kennedys. Bobby never let Johnson, even as vice president, live that down. And I go deep into that in the book as well. But this is something that the mob did believe for the most part, that the Kennedys would back off. However, Trafficante and Marcello, who were also very close with Jimmy Hoffa, those 3, Hoffa, Trafficante, and Marcello, never believed for a moment that the Kennedys would not keep coming after them, specifically Bobby.
Yeah, I think that pretty well sums up the 1960 election. That was the question I was going to ask you. Those bosses who did not support Kennedy, who were they? There you go. Marcello, Trafficante, throw Jimmy Hoffa in for good measure. Let's move on to, I want to talk a little Robert Maheu, CIA-Mafia plots, if we can, because kind of the approach that I took towards this was to look at sort of what's the official story behind it, like because there is an official story on CIA-Mafia plots in the form of the Church Committee report. Right? So I looked at that, and then I looked at witness testimony as well. In particular, a guy named Bradley Ayers. You ever heard of this guy, Bradley Ayers? He wrote a book, but he was in the military, and he was basically stationed at JM Wave as a paramilitary trainer to assist at JM Wave. And he lays out how Roselli is down there at the camp more than a year after the Church Committee says everything's totally wrapped up. So anyway, but I just want to touch on a few of those points here real quick in the spirit of recapping. So Robert Maheu, he's recruited out of law school to work as an FBI counterintelligence officer in Europe during World War II. When he came back, he opened a private detective firm with the CIA as one of his primary clients. Maheu then became a CIA cutout where the agency couldn't be involved. They had plausible deniability in each respective project. The Mission Impossible TV show was based on Maheu, so that's pretty cool. Billionaire military industrialist Howard Hughes also worked with Maheu as his right-hand man. And Maheu was Hughes' right-hand man starting in 1955. And he was brought in to help the CIA connect with the mafia through Johnny Roselli. That was the method he used. And now the official story is that the CIA, it was the CIA who came up with the idea for Maheu to reach out to Roselli. And then Maheu was contacted by this guy, James O'Connell of the CIA, who happened to already be close friends with Maheu. And he even knew Roselli because he had had dinner with Maheu and Roselli at Maheu's house before. So, but according to JFK press secretary Pierre Salinger, Maheu said that Nixon was the one who was pushing the CIA to work with the mafia, and all this stuff really came from Nixon. I know that's kind of a nuanced question, but do you think that what did you come across in terms of, the thing that got the CIA mafia plots started? Was it an internal decision in the CIA, or was it Nixon reaching out to Howard Hughes?
So it's quite possible that Nixon had a hand in it, and I'll explain why. I did not have enough evidence to state that Nixon was the guy, the motivator behind it in the book. I have to be very careful as an historian to put what I can factually put down on paper as best I can, and then draw my own conclusions from the facts, obviously. But I could not find enough evidence that Nixon was the one who sort of motivated the whole thing into existence. However, it was very possible because Nixon was somebody who went down to Cuba a lot and had friends go down to Cuba a lot, dear friends of his who were big campaign contributors to his campaigns, were constantly in Cuba when the mob ran Havana. So there was a friend that got taken for a ride in one of the casinos in Havana. He got back to the States and called Nixon and said, Nixon, you got to get my money back. These guys hustled me. And Nixon got on the phone and said, give this guy back his money. You can't do that. And then, so there's, and Nixon was obviously, we know later on from Watergate that he may have had something to do with the Cuban exiles who were working with the CIA. That came out. Also, Nixon, when the Cuban exiles were being trained by the CIA for the Bay of Pigs invasion, we're also aware that Nixon was supposed to take over for Eisenhower. They believed Nixon would be elected president after Eisenhower. They never saw Kennedy coming. So they figured, well, Nixon will be easy. He'll go in after Eisenhower and he'll take over the whole thing with the CIA. And the CIA at that point is working with the mob to kill Castro. So Nixon would be apprised of that. It's very, very possible. However, I was able to, the evidence that I have is Maheu was approached. The CIA decides that hey, the mob kills. They must want to kill this Castro. They lost Havana. Let's approach somebody. So they started to put feelers out. They started to go to different people, and they eventually approached Maheu. And Maheu had an experience when he went to Las Vegas once. He was there to serve a subpoena to a big shot in Las Vegas, and nobody was giving him a room because they all knew why he was down there. They're like, all the rooms are packed up. Beat it, bum. Nobody wants to give up the guy. The mob runs Vegas at the time. So Maheu then gets told by somebody else, hey, give this guy Johnny Roselli a call. He'll help you out. So he calls Roselli, and Roselli says, no problem. I'll put you in a bungalow. And the phone rings. He's got everything comped through the hotel. They roll out the red carpet for him. He rips up the subpoena, says, I'm not even going to serve it. I'm glad I met Johnny Roselli. So Johnny Roselli's like the ambassador to Vegas, right? So Roselli then, when Maheu's approached, he says, I'm friends with Roselli, and he's a mob guy, and you're never going to believe he's a mob guy because he's so low key. And so he's not like, bada bing, bada bang, let's kill this guy. Let's wrap a garrote around his neck and chop him up in pieces. There are guys like that in the mob, but there are also the big earners and the big movers, usually low key guys. So he says, look, you could meet him and I'll show you this guy. And they couldn't even believe when the agents went to a clam bake in Maheu's backyard that they couldn't believe this guy's Johnny Roselli's a real gangster. To give you another added example of how he was so hard to believe to be a gangster. And he had been killing people since he's a teenager, by the way. The guy was treacherous, but he knew how to conduct himself around very big people. He knew how to run in different circles. There was a Hollywood producer who Roselli used to straighten out union beefs for. And that producer said, look, I got a guy playing a gangster. Can he hang out with you one night? So he could kind of like get the moves and mannerisms from you and pick up stuff. I'd really love for him to see what a real gangster's like. So the guy, Roselli says, sure, let's go to a ball game. So they go to a ball game. The guy calls up the movie producer and he says, I didn't get shit from this guy. He goes, what do you mean? He goes, I learned more from watching TV. He goes, this guy ain't a gangster. He goes, he picked up the tab. He's as sweet as could be. He holds the door for me. He says he's polite. He gives me the seat. He gives me He goes, this guy's the nicest guy I ever met. He goes, I'm playing a gangster. He goes, this guy's got his, there was nothing about him that was gangster. So that's how the CIA saw him as well. So they make this sort of, they draw him in. And at first, Roselli thought he's being set up. He's like, the government wants to work with me. You guys are trying to put me out, put me away for the rest of my life at all times. Now you want me to work with you? And Maheu convinces him that it's real. And then Maheu, because Maheu answers to the Chicago mob run by Sam Giancana. So Maheu's got to clear it. That's how the mob works. You got to clear it with your boss. You can't just go and do something and say, if you work for a big company, you can't start cutting deals, right? You work for Microsoft. You can't just cut a deal with Dell tomorrow. You got to take it up the ladder, right? Same thing with Roselli. He's got to clear it with Giancana. He goes to Giancana. Giancana says, yeah, I'll get involved. That son of a bitch Castro, we'd love to kill him. So now Giancana and Roselli are involved. Giancana's pulled in because he's the boss, Roselli's boss. But then Giancana says there's territorial places. And because JM Wave and all the Cuban exiles are in Miami, they got to clear it now with Santo Trafficante. So Giancana then reaches out to Trafficante, one boss reaching out to another. And he says, listen, we were looking to clip Castro. We need your help because we got to work with the CIA and exiles down in Miami. And that's where the JM Wave station is. And he says, sure, no problem. He says, I'm in on it too. Now Trafficante's involvement in the plot, his dedication to the plot, has always been suspect. And it was eventually suspect by none other than William Harvey. So keep that in mind because all of the plots against Castro failed. And it later came out that they failed because Trafficante may have been a double agent. Why would be and I go through this meticulously in my book, and I have all the notes and all the testimony pointing to Trafficante as a double agent. Why would Trafficante be a double agent? Well, he loves his country, like Johnny Roselli did. The mob made big money here. America was the land of the free, home of the brave. They loved it. They did great here, the mob. They had no reason to despise the American government or the American way of life. Why would he be a double agent for Castro? Well, he's in Miami after Castro takes Havana. He moves his headquarters from Tampa to Miami, where all the Cubans are coming. And there's a huge flow of drugs coming through a Cuban pipeline into Miami. And Trafficante's running all those drugs because Castro needed to prop up his horrible economy and keep that drug pipeline open. So he's the guy on this end running all that drugs. He doesn't want to see Castro die. Castro dies, that Cuban pipeline that's being kept open by Castro may collapse if the American government gets back into Havana and closes down the pipeline. So that's the reason why Trafficante may have been a double agent and may have gotten in the way of all those plots from succeeding. But that's a whole story in itself.
Well, no, that goes on to the sort of the next point is they put the team together and they're trying to kill Castro. And so they start to, pursue different plots to kill him. Oh, we're going to give poison pills and someone's going to slip it into, his food or his drink. But then that person got fired. Oh, we're going to give poison pills and we're going to put it in his meal at this restaurant he always goes to. But then he stopped going to the restaurant. Mm-hmm. But then you find out that, wait a minute, the people that the CIA, Roselli was bringing in really worked for Trafficante in Cuba because if you're running the casinos, you got to have people. You got to have frontline people, right? So that's very interesting. Your point that maybe he was playing both sides, and that's not to say that Trafficante himself is. We'll get to that later, but the Trafficante necessarily turned the plot away from Castro to Kennedy, but he might have tried to make sure that it didn't actually happen against Castro.
Well, at one point or another, there is a lot of evidence that Trafficante did participate in the plot against Kennedy. At the very least, he was aware of the plot before time. And that goes to what, as I'm sure you know, and your viewers would even know, Jose Aleman said to him, Jose Aleman was the distinguished child of, the child of a distinguished part of Cuba's previous government, fled to America. He had tons of assets and money in America, in the United States, in Miami specifically. He worked hand in hand with Trafficante, development deals. Trafficante would help him get Teamster loans to build hotels through Hoffa. So they were hand in hand. They were very close. But Aleman was also an FBI and CIA informant. So Trafficante says to him, look, Kennedy's going to buy it when he comes down south. He's dead. And he tells him that And Trafficante immediately reports this to his FBI handlers, who were later interviewed and admitted that he told them beforehand. So there's no question that Trafficante, at the very least, knew he would be killed.
Yeah.
At the very least.
You're saying Trafficante told the FBI himself?
Told Jose Aleman.
Aleman, yeah,
and
right.
then Aleman left Trafficante. So the day they meet at the Scott Bryan Hotel, I think it was, for lunch, and they're discussing a development deal for a big building project that Trafficante is helping Aleman acquire through a Teamster pension fund loan. In the course of that, they mention Kennedy, because Bobby Kennedy is up Trafficante's ass as well as Marcello's ass, who was very close friends with Trafficante. So Aleman brings him up, and in response, Trafficante says, this Bobby is trampling on the rights of U.S. citizens left and right, including ours. And it's okay, though, because Jack's going to be removed from office soon enough. He's going to be out. He's buying it when he comes down south. So Aleman asked him, what do you mean he's buying it? He goes, he's getting killed. He's getting whacked. Done. Later, many years later, when Aleman is called before a committee, he changes that to, well, he meant he was going to get hit by a lot of Republican votes. He didn't mean he was going to get hit by a rifle. And after that testimony, immediately after that testimony, he is questioned by staffers who he told, I had no choice but to say that. I'm scared to death for my life. Trafficante will kill me. Are you kidding me? This came out now? I'm done. And sure enough, he killed himself thinking the mob was going to kill him. So, all of that, again, I detail this extremely well in the book. I urge your listeners to read the book, Clash of Titans, the Borgata trilogy. Clash of Titans is the second volume. If you love mafia history, read them all. If you just love the Kennedy stuff, read the second volume. Most of it's in there. There is other mafia history in there. You could skip over the pages if you want. But the Kennedy stuff is really was my passion. I would have loved to even publish a book alone about Kennedy, but because it was so interesting. But Trafficante knew prior to the assassination that it was going to happen. And you usually don't know that unless someone tells you who's on the inside, if not you yourself is doing it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And so just back to the CIA, Maheu plots and all that. So basically nothing really happens. And maybe that was because Trafficante was trying to make sure nothing happened to Castro.
Trafficante had said to his attorney years later, they kept giving me these pills and I flushed them down the toilet. He had no interest in killing Castro. He's got a pipeline making him $1 million a month. What the hell does he need to kill Castro for and blow that?
That's a great insight for sure.
Yeah.
But here's a question I have, sort of the tension between the official story and this other guy's account, this guy Bradley Ayers that I had mentioned. So, the official story is in April of 1962, Bill Harvey takes over. And then by February of 1963, he shuts the whole operation down, tells Roselli that it's over, taper off your communications. By the way, they never told the Cuban exiles that the $150,000 reward for killing Castro was gone. They didn't relay that information. But anyway, what's interesting is this guy Ayers, who the CIA issued a press release saying, yes, he did work for us. He's lying, but he did work for us and he was physically present. But he kind of lays out that Roselli was down at the training camps, in the Florida Keys and JM Wave Station as well, and was referred to as Colonel Roselli.
Imagine.
And so, I mean, to me, my whole thing is, look, the JFK assassination is going to bring out some crazy people. There will be crazy people that come forth that are just totally lying.
But as is telling the truth on that note, because there was other evidence that following the Bay of Pigs, we have the missile crisis. And during the missile crisis, the CIA is told to stand down while Kennedy figures out if he's going to quarantine the island or attack. He's got two choices: send in the Marines or quarantine the island and turn away all Soviet ships and subs. While Kennedy is contemplating that crucial decision as we sit on the brink of war, of nuclear war possibly, and I have to give credit, look, I'm against Kennedy's decision. I would have told him to go in. I would have told him, send in the Marines. This is your chance, just as the Joint Chiefs of Staff believed it to be. But there's a 1% chance that it all rests on Kennedy too. And you have to give him credit. There's a 1% chance that it's not going to be resolved after the Marines attack, and the Soviets will launch a missile. And then you've got a nuclear holocaust on your hands. So to be fair to Kennedy, although I think it was the wrong decision, and I would have urged him if I was in the cabinet to say, I would have said, send in the Marines, let's go. They have no right to put missiles right off the border of right outside Florida, 90 miles off, the coast of Florida. However, Kennedy felt like if there's one chance in a million, no, these guys launched this crackpot in Russia, and Khrushchev launches the missiles. What do I do? And who could take that away from Kennedy? Who are we to question him? He's got the fate of the world in his hands. So that said, the CIA is told to stand down as Kennedy makes this decision. Well, Harvey says, F that, I ain't standing down. And he keeps sending these sabotage raids into Cuba. And Roselli was supposedly part of them. Later on, Harvey and Bobby go at each other's throats. Bobby says, you were told to stand down. You're supposed to listen. I'm the attorney general. How dare you? My brother's the president, etc. Harvey says, go F yourself. If it wasn't for you and your idiot, treacherous brother, you two morons, we wouldn't even be in this mess because you blew it at the Bay of Pigs and you blew it again now. So Harvey and him went at each other's throats. And then Harvey, the CIA grabbed him and says, look, we're going to, before Bobby fires you and destroys your life, orders us to fire you, let's get you out of the country. We're going to relocate you to Italy. You'll be the station chief of Rome. That's a big deal because the CIA was basically controlling Italy at the time as a buttress against communism, because Italy was sort of teetering on, they had a huge communist electorate in Italy at the time, and the CIA needed to, that would have extended the Cold War wall all the way into Western Europe. We couldn't have that. So at the time, Harvey, we think, is being relocated and it's done. But there's plenty of evidence and plenty of testimony that said, no, he never stopped dealing. And he was ordered to stay away from Roselli, by the way, that he never stopped dealing with Roselli and never stopped meeting with him. And they were the best of friends. And they would have literally go out, get drunk, and curse the Kennedys together. And these guys are being seen in marinas down in South Florida. They're being seen in the Keys, like you said. And now it's come out, as I understand it, through the new documents that were released, that Harvey was given some type of pass to fly around the country. Even after we thought he was finished, he was given some type of pass to fly around the country without, officially logging in as a passenger on these flights. So what the hell's going on? We don't know. Also, to the CIA, the FBI. Hoover's always on top of everybody, right? That's why, once again, until Kennedy gets hit, people will think the FBI was involved, but I found no evidence to suggest that the FBI was involved prior to the assassination. Yeah. Now, were they involved in the cover-up? 1,000,000%. Nobody could deny that. But prior to the assassination, Hoover's just not involved. He's ignoring evidence. That would make him a co-conspirator. If you want to say, hey, look, if you see a crime, you're supposed to report it. People will tell you, well, then you're just as bad as the guilty if you don't report it. Okay, Hoover's not reporting the crime, but he's not actively involved in the conspiracy in any which way. He may be seeing transcripts come across his desk of mobsters saying they're going to kill Kennedy. These things are coming across his desk. I list every one of them that have come to light. And he's ignoring them. He's not reporting them to the Secret Service. He's not reporting them to the Kennedy White House. He's not reporting them to the Attorney General. So something's wrong. But the FBI was not involved in the conspiracy. And the agents are clean as could be too. The FBI agents were clean. Now, however, the FBI is following Roselli, and leading up in November, they lose track of him for like a week and a half. They have no idea where he is, where he went, and then the assassination comes. And he pops up again afterwards. Where the hell was Roselli? And how'd the FBI lose him? So, that's sort of a blank that we may never know.
I wasn't aware of that. So,
Yeah.
Okay, Roselli was being followed by the FBI. You've seen documents to show they're following him.
And I cited in my book. He's being followed by the FBI. And then he's last seen, he flies to Washington with another man and two women. And he's going to meet either a congressman or a senator. I forget what it's in my book. So he's meeting a member of Congress, and I think they backed off at that moment, but then they lost track of him. So obviously the FBI, Hoover was never big on unless he did it for his own personal blackmailing, Hooverian reasons, Hoover really wasn't big on taking down senators or congressmen. He was big on getting the goods on them and saying, by the way, one of my agents spotted you with gangster hoodlum element Johnny Roselli, and I just wanted to let you know, don't worry about that file. It's buried. I'm never going to let anyone see it. Wink, wink. Make sure you do what I tell you to do and vote how I want you to vote, especially when the budget committee meets for the FBI. That's the type of guy Hoover was. So, but FBI agents were following Roselli, lost track of him, and I cite exactly, the sources where that comes from.
Good. Yeah. Well, so we talked about in the podcast that the HSCA looked at this question of, did the mafia kill Kennedy? And they determined that the commission at large did not order it, but they didn't have any surveillance, or they had almost no surveillance on Marcello and Trafficante. So they kind of accepted them from the official finding. So what I want to do is go through some of the major bosses and just kind of do not necessarily a speed round, but I want to just get your takes on sort of each of these players and maybe how they fit in or how they don't fit in. Okay, so we'll start out with Jimmy Hoffa.
Yeah, just to be clear, because a lot of people will mistake Jimmy Hoffa for some type of mobster or mob boss, and he wasn't. A deep dive into Jimmy Hoffa, which I have done, reveals him to be exactly what he was. He was the leader of the Teamsters union, which was nationwide, one of the biggest, if not the biggest union in the country. Next to maybe the UAW run by Walter Reuther. He's up there, Hoffa. He's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, the Teamsters were. And the Teamsters were from the beginning of the Teamster unions, the Mafia, and I go through this heavily in book 1 of the trilogy, which is called Borgata, Rise of Empire, which is volume 1. The Mafia infiltrated all of the labor unions in the United States, and they saw it as an easy way to control industry. If we could control the labor unions, and we could then act as mediators when management has a problem with the workers, and we could then squeeze deals for ourselves, and we could also then direct profits and contracts to companies that we own. So the Mafia immediately realized that the unions were ripe for picking, and they slowly but surely infiltrated themselves into the American labor movement. And the American labor, anyone who's familiar with the early American labor movement will know that it was very violent. They were constantly, whether you read about what's his name, Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man, Frick, when he had a problem and there was murders involved, and he would call out the security forces he would hire, and they would fight the workers and people would get killed. Up and through the Teamster movement, Hoffa maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 times he was in, drop down bloody fights on the front lines, Hoffa, and he talks about it, arrested, sent to the hospital. This is all documented. Every time Hoffa was, he got into the mix. So the American labor movement, because it's violent at the time, and management then would, they would have a picket line, and then they would cross who crosses the picket line, then gets attacked, etc. And then all of them go into a melee. It was violent. So the mob sees violence as well. We monopolize violence in this country. Nobody else. The only two people who have a monopoly on violence throughout the 20th century was the U.S. government and the Mafia. Those were the only two entities. And Estes Kefalva called the Mafia a government within a government. So if you want to talk about it, they're kind of two governments, according to Estes Kefalva. Those were the only two people who want to control violence. But the government hadn't put in enough laws to regulate unions and regulate attacks on unions, etc. So the Mafia sort of moved in. So when Hoffa becomes the president of the Teamsters, he doesn't do it by, hey, elect me, I'm Jimmy Hoffa. He does it because the mob has the locals. They're controlling the locals that get votes. And if you don't go to the mob and make sure that they deliver the votes to you, you're not going to get elected Teamster president. So he's got to make alliances with mobsters in specifically Chicago, Detroit, and New York. Those are the three places that they had really Detroit, because Hoffa was from Detroit. So the Detroit mob had their claws into him. Chicago, because Chicago controls everything west of Chicago, and New York, who controls everything from the eastern seaboard to Chicago. So those are the two big entities besides Detroit where Hoffa is from. If they don't tell you you're going to be president, you're not going to be president. That's just the math. That's the way it is. 1 + 1 = 2. That's how it works. So Hoffa then has to make a deal with the mob. In doing so, he was a tough guy, by the way. He didn't always roll over when the mob asked him for favors. If the mob came to him, and I lay this out in the book, if the mob came to Hoffa with a crap deal and said, I'm opening up a coffee company, I need $5 million, and he looks at the coffee company and says, this ain't worth a shit. You ain't getting a nickel out of Hoffa. I don't care what boss you are, who you come from. If you run all 5 families in New York, you ain't getting that money, period. And nobody runs all 5 families, but hypothetically. But if you came to Hoffa with a deal and you're a mobster and you say, look, I'm going to build an airport with 6 hotels around it, and I'm going to open up 2 casinos, and we're going to draw gamblers in, and Hoffa thinks it's a good deal, how much you need? $50 million. You got it. He writes a check. So Hoffa always invested positively in terms of returns for the Teamster pension fund. There's no denying he made big money for the Teamsters. But he is doing it in a nefarious way now and then because he's getting involved with deals that are schemes, but they're run by mobsters and they end up being good. They end up being profitable. They obviously, I say schemes in terms of the mob's involved, so something's going to be wrong. But on paper, it's a good deal, and Hoffa don't give you the money unless it's a good deal. So right. Hoffa now is in with the mob. He's in with the bosses, and the bosses sort of have a really good relationship with them, and the Teamster pension fund is eventually worth hundreds of millions. So when they need something like Trafficante needed money for Aleman's hotel, he could call up Jimmy Hoffa and say, look, I know Jose Aleman. He makes plenty of money. He's a big earner down here in Miami. If he's already scoped out the hotel, it's going to make a good return for your Teamsters. And so Hoffa knows it's a mob boss, obviously. He knows it's illegal, but he also knows he needs Trafficante to deliver the unions in Florida when he needs them. And Trafficante controlled a few unions as well. So they make deals. That said, when Hoffa hated Bobby and Bobby was coming after Hoffa too, Hoffa knew that Marcello and Trafficante also hated Bobby. And those 3 men, Hoffa, Trafficante, and Marcello, were usually instrumental in wanting to kill John Kennedy with whoever was willing to do it with them. Now, it was Hoffa now at one point or another. If anybody thinks Hoffa was directly involved, this is what I came to the conclusion that through all the evidence that I researched. Marcello and Trafficante were typical mob bosses. They wanted to kill John Kennedy to get rid of Bobby, by the way. It wasn't to kill John Kennedy. Marcello made numerous statements to the effect of, if you cut the dog's tail off, you still get bitten. You got to cut the head off, and the head and tail and head die together. Meaning you got to go after Jack Kennedy. Another time he said, you kill Bobby and Jack will send out the Marines to destroy us. He'll send out the militia. We're done. You got to kill Jack, and Bobby gets, he's done the next day. He's out. Nobody's going to keep him, especially Lyndon Johnson, who despised Bobby. So they knew if they could get Johnson in, Bobby's gone. So that's why they start to focus on John. That's not to say that the CIA had the same motives as the mob. The CIA wants to take out Kennedy because they want to dump it on, I get heavily into this in my book as well. They want to dump it on Oswald as a lone shooter who appears to have escaped or trying to escape and was killed in the process of escaping to Cuba because Castro was behind it. They wanted it to look like that so that the American public would demand an invasion of Cuba, which is what they wanted during the missile crisis, and they didn't get it. And now they figured, you know what? If we get rid of Jack Kennedy, and they were terrified that Jack Kennedy was going to get in for another 4 years and was going to destroy the United States by the end of that 4 years. You got to look at politics today, how each side despises the other and says it's the end of the world if you vote for the other side. They do it all day long. Think back now in 1960s, that's exactly how the CIA viewed Kennedy. They said he's easy on communism, he's easy on the Soviets, he's exchanging love letters with Khrushchev. we're going to be done. This guy gets in another 4 years. The whole country's done. Freedom is over. So this is how they thought of it, to give you an idea of their motivation behind saying, we got to get rid of him.
I want to ask you, because so on Hoffa, then I understand basically, because I always wondered, why is he afforded this level of clout? He's not a made man, but the answer is because he controlled the money and because he did the mafia right, for the most part. Now, let me ask you a quick question. I don't want to go super deep on this, but I just feel like I would kick myself if I didn't ask you this. Do you have thoughts on the film The Irishman as it relates
Yeah,
to
totally. I mean, I don't want to knock another writer who put time and effort into it. What I will say is this: Sheehan was indisputably a mobster and a tough guy and a big guy with the unions. There's no arguing that point. I read the book and I did research around it. There's no doubt that Sheehan is who he claims to be, in the sense that he was close with Russell Buffalino, who was the boss of Pennsylvania. He was close with the Teamsters and he was close with Hoffa. There's no denying that. However, here's the big however. I'm reading the book and I know who killed Joey Gallo at Umberto's Clam House. It was a guy by the name of Sonny Pinto. This is, for your viewers or listeners, this is a slight departure, but try to follow me. Joey Gallo was part of the Colombo family, originally the Profaci family. And he launched a rebellion against Profaci. At some point or another, years later, they decide they want to kill Joey Gallo. The family does. The Profaci family, which is now the Colombo family. They're going to kill Joey Gallo. So eventually he's seen in Umberto's Clam House in Manhattan's Little Italy. And Sonny Pinto is down the block eating Chinese food with a couple of guys. And this guy, Joe Fish Luparelli, spots Gallo at the Clam House. And he runs down the block and he bursts into the Chinese restaurant and he says, "Hey, Sonny, guess who's in the Clam House? Joey Gallo." He spits up his food. He can't believe it. He says, "Let me get the green light from Joe Yak." Now, not only do I know this from actual history, but I know people who were involved. This is 1970s. This isn't that long ago. There are people who are still alive that could tell me about this. So I talked to them. Joey Gallo, then, these guys left the Chinese restaurant and they called Joe Yak, who was the consigliere of the family. And they says, "Look, Joe, we got Joey Gallo up the block. Should we take him out?" He says, "What the hell are you waiting for? Hang up the phone and get on it." Hang up the phone. They don't even have time. Usually if you're going to do a heist or a hit, you get a crash car, you steal a car so that you could crash a car. If there's a cop car in pursuit, comes down the block, the crash car slams into the cop car and gives the guys time to do it and get away. They don't have time for a crash car. They don't have time to steal a getaway car. You also want to steal a getaway car. You don't want to kill somebody and leave in your own car, right? They don't have time. They go, "We're going to use our own cars. Go run up to the apartment down the block, get the pistols, and let's go in." So Sonny Pinto and these two other guys go in and they blast Gallo and they kill him. This is known throughout the underworld, throughout the New York underworld. There's no disputing this, that Sonny Pinto did it. When my friend was boss of the Colombo family, he took over the family in the late 1980s, early 1990s. He was still sending a stipend to Sonny Pinto, who was on the lam since he killed Gallo 20 years earlier, because the family's still taking care of him because he made a sacrifice for the family. So this is not even a question. So I'm reading the Sheehan book and he says, "Yeah, I killed Joey Gallo too. Besides blowing half his brains out, I also killed Joey Gallo. I shot him right in his head at Umberto's." I know it's bullshit. So now I say to myself, all right, the guy just lied, blatant lie. Why is he lying? So there's a couple of reasons you might say maybe why he's lying. Maybe he wanted to, in case he's pinched for something, he wants to say, "Oh, I tell lies and truth. I don't know that was a lie. You can't get me for that. I was just making it up." I don't know why the guy's lying, but I know he's lying. So now go back to the Hoffa murder. He says he did that too. At first he said it was a guy named Sally Bugs Bergoglio. Then he went back on it and said it was him. Why did he say it's him? Originally he said it was Sally Bugs. Everybody knows it was Sally Bugs that pulled the trigger. So if it was Sally Bugs that pulled the trigger, why did you say it's you? Well, now there's a lot of money on the table. They want to make a book about him. They want to do a movie about him. They want to do documentaries. He's going to be a superstar. He's going to make millions of dollars. I did it. So once again, go back to what I originally said. Was he a gangster? Yes. Was he a tough guy? Absolutely. There were plenty of tough Irish guys in the mob. Hughes Apple's McIntosh was Carmine Persico was the head of the Colombo family years later and kept it for years, for decades. His main guy, right-hand man, was Hughes Apple's McIntosh, big tough Irishman. There were plenty of Irish tough guys in the mob. Sheehan was a tough Irish guy in the mob. There's no doubt about that. Was he involved with the Teamsters? Did he know Hoffa? Did he answer directly to Russell Bufalino? Yes, yes, and yes. Did he shoot Hoffa in the head? He said it was Bergoglio first, who everybody agrees with. Then he said it was himself. And when he said it was himself, he also threw in, I shot Joey Gallo. I don't believe he pulled the trigger.
So it's a money grab.
It's a money grab. Was he in the know to some extent? I think so. I think if you're around Russell Bufalino, and Bufalino was definitely have something to do with it. Bufalino was back and forth. Half his body was incinerated at a garbage disposal place. This is what all the leads led to. This is not my hunch. There were people, informants who came forward, said, this place, they incinerated like a dozen guys there. First of all, if you're going to do a hit on Hoffa, you got to make sure that body disappears. It's Jimmy Hoffa, the head of the labor movement. You don't want that body popping up somewhere in the investigation. You want him to disappear. That's number one. Number two, for years before I did the research, I used to hear they disposed of him in Yankee Stadium or Giant Stadium in the Verrazano Bridge in New Jersey. And I'm going, what are they out of their minds? The FBI, how dumb could they be to listen to these idiots lying to them? Nobody's traveling 1,200 miles with a body. When you're taking Hoffa and you know you're killing him, either that hole is pre-dug and it's within 10, 15 minutes from where you are, or the incinerator is already revved up to 100,000 degrees and you're ready to throw him in, because you're not going to drive. You think I'm going to start going through tolls with the body? Come on. Oh, no, there's a trooper. I hope he don't pull me over. I got Jimmy Hoffa in my trunk. Give me a break. The mob aren't idiots. They're going to get rid of the guy right there in Michigan. So with the place where they believe he was incinerated, Russell Bufalino, leading up to Hoffa's disappearance, is back and forth on the phone with the guys who own that company constantly, leading up to the day Hoffa disappears, and suddenly the phone calls shut off. I mean, come on.
That's pretty fun.
Yeah, come on. It's evidence right there.
All right, hey, let's move on to Meyer Lansky real quick. And I mean, look, my understanding is he had a lot of involvement in Cuba, sort of the mob's accountant, obviously his relationships with Lucky Luciano, really showing people how to do offshore banking. Is there any tie-in between Meyer Lansky and the Kennedy assassination?
No, I'm going to tell you what I think, and this comes from all of the evidence and research that I've done. In my first volume, Meyer Lansky plays a central role in volume 1 of the Borgata trilogy, Rise of Empire. He plays a central role because he was sort of like the untitled consigliere of the entire mob, and he was directly answered to Lucky Luciano, but could speak with Luciano's tongue. He was as respected as any mob boss in the country at that time. There's no taking that away from Meyer Lansky. He was an absolute genius. He was respected. What he said was law, and he spoke with Lucky Luciano's tongue, meaning if Lansky walks into a social club and says, this is what you're going to do, I don't care how big the mobsters were. He's speaking for the boss. You're going to listen to him. So there's no taking that away from Lansky. Lansky was instrumental in opening up Cuba. He had relations with Fulgencio Batista. Lansky was instrumental in paving the way of Ben Siegel going into Vegas and continuing to build Vegas with Frank Costello afterwards, alongside the Chicago mob, who were always the more bigger powerhouses in Vegas than New York. But Lansky and Costello were partners with the Chicago mob in a lot of those hotel casinos. So there's no taking anything away from Lansky. However, Lansky, there's no evidence to point to Lansky being part of the conspiracy other than somebody mentioned, he said, oh, I put $1 million on Kennedy's head or something if somebody takes him out, which he could have said in passing, aggravated, I don't know. But whatever the case is, there's no real evidence pointing to Lansky as the man. The other thing, there's a couple of other reasons you could lay out. Lansky wasn't in hot water like Trafficante and Marcello and Hoffa was. He wasn't in the same problems later on in life. During the 1970s, he had problems like they did, but not in the 60s, number one. Number two is Lansky was too smart and too patriotic to kill a United States president. He loved our country, and he was just too smart. I'm not going to get involved with killing a president. Why? When the president's not doing anything to me. Everything points to Marcello and Trafficante with Hoffa in the background, lurking in the background. And at some point, it seems that Marcello and Trafficante kind of shut Hoffa out of everything and wanted him to make it look like they were doing him a favor, though, so they could get more money from the pension fund. Hey, we did you a favor. We got rid of that Kennedy. Meanwhile, they were getting rid of him for themselves, and kind of for Hoffa too, but mostly for themselves.
So, okay, let's go on to Sam Giancana. Real quick, and I know you know so much about all this stuff. It's kind of like where to even start. But what we covered is how he came up through the Chicago Mafia. He was kind of everywhere in terms of he wasn't just in Chicago. He was doing deals in a lot of other places, Las Vegas most notably. And he had a good relationship with Marcello and Trafficante. He was looping him in on the Las Vegas skim. Obviously, he was involved. We talked about earlier through Johnny Roselli. He was brought in on the CIA plots. What I found really interesting about Giancana, so obviously he knows about the CIA plots. Okay, and he's looped in on them, and then he leverages. He goes, "Oh, we got this relationship with the feds. Great. I was wondering what they think about Dan Rowan and if he's trying to hook up with my girlfriend." You know what I mean?
The guy turned out to be a complete F up. So I'm gonna give my opinion on
please.
Yeah, so Sam Giancana is a legitimate tough guy, but a quiet tough guy. He comes up through the ranks in the Chicago mob, does what he's got to do, and he's known as a stable, like in other words, stable in the sense that even though he kills people, you would think somebody who kills people is unstable, but there are plenty of guys who could live, Tony Soprano, think of for your viewers. He goes home, he kisses his wife and kids, he loves them, he's stable, but he also cuts somebody's head off in a bathtub. So Giancana is sort of thought of as like that. He'll kill you in a minute, but he's stable. You could trust him with the Borgata. They gave him Joe Zaccardo. Anthony Joe Zaccardo was the boss of the Chicago mob, the real boss. Then he had a couple of guys around him, Ayupa, Inglesi. There was a few guys around Ricardo and Paul the Way to Rica. And I think Paul the Way to Rica was the guy who groomed Giancana. In other words, brought him up into life and says, look, it's safe. We'll give him the reins. We want to kind of step into the shadows because there's a lot of heat. And we'll let Giancana be the front man. Now, Giancana, he was known, as I said, as a stable, quiet guy. His wife dies suddenly. And it's very sad because he was a loving husband. But his wife dies suddenly. And all of a sudden, he's running around like a lunatic in Vegas with Frank Sinatra, capping anything he could get his hands on. And, he's like acting like a teenage boy. And, people are going, what are you doing? Rein it in. He's fooling around, having all these love affairs with all these different women. And then he's jealous of this guy, comedian, who's supposed to be fooling around with this singer, Phyllis McGuire, who he's dating. And he really, really lowered himself because a big mob boss is not supposed to be chasing a woman. Women come to me. I'm the boss, right? It's like the quote unquote manly thing. Like, I don't chase women. They want to come to me, or they don't. That's what, but all of a sudden now Giancana's going, oh, she's got a boyfriend. Can we bug the apartment and see? You're kind of diminishing your own value, right? So he's chasing the girl, and now he's asking the CIA. So the mob's starting to think of him as like, maybe he's a problem. Maybe he's got to be removed, which they eventually do. They eventually take him out and they kill him, right?
To your point on Phyllis McGuire, she wasn't the only one. There's also Judith Exner. So Judith Exner, she was with Frank Sinatra, and then he introduced her to JFK, and then she started having an affair with JFK, and then once Giancana found out about it, then he started having an affair with her, and then the affair was shut down after the Hoover meeting, and Hoover called it out and all that. Let me ask you this. Who do you think killed Giancana and why? Did you ever
Oh,
look
they
at?
know who it was Butch Blassie. I mean, Ocado ordered it. So when Giancana comes out of, he leaves for Mexico. He wants to be done. He leaves for Mexico. He's traveling the world. He's opening up casinos. He's making a lot of money and he's enjoying himself. Giancana always loved being with women after his wife died. So he's dating all kinds of women and he's living the high life. And he's an older man at the time, but he wants to live it up. He's got money. He's out of Chicago. He doesn't have to worry about anything. And he's floating around doing his thing in other places in the world. Eventually, they bring him back to the United States. They put pressure on the Mexican government to deport him back to the United States because they want to question him in front of committees, right? So he comes back. Okay. So he takes a hit, a contempt of court, and goes to jail. He gets out again. They want to subpoena him again. At some point, the Chicago mob knows that they're never going to let up with this guy. And the other thing is, we told him to sort of just like take a powder, but now they're not even letting him leave. So he's in our face. We got to get rid of him. So Joe Batters is the only person who could. Anthony Joe Batters Ocado is the boss, as I said, of Chicago. The boss is the only guy who could sanction a hit. It's got to come from Joe Batters. Nobody else could just decide that they want to kill Giancana. If you do, you're dead the next day. It's got to come from the boss. So Joe Batters obviously puts a contract on Giancana and says, look, get rid of him. He's going to another committee hearing tomorrow. Before the committee hearing, just get rid of this guy and it's done. And that they really, really felt like they had their hands tied because they did not want another round of publicity for killing him. They just wanted him to go away. And originally he did. But now he was dragged back and there's a whole nother round of publicity. Let's just end it. Get rid of this guy. So Butch Blassie goes to dinner at his house. When Butch Blassie leaves, the whole family's there. Giancana's daughter, the brother-in-law, they're all having dinner in the basement. Italians, when I grew up, Italians always had kitchens in the basement. The reason why was we couldn't afford air conditioning in the summer. And if we were going to cook in New York, you got a cool basement. It's a little cooler. You cook in the basement, you eat in the basement. Giancana's in the basement and he's frying up his things in the kitchen basement. And Blassie leaves. Now, there's two cars sitting on Giancana's house. There's a federal surveillance and a state surveillance. They just happen to drive away. They drive away for that little stitch of time where he's killed. And one of them says, oh, yeah, we just figured we'll take a ride. And we saw Butch Blassie enter the house, but we figured they're just friends. So they'll just have, what are we going to sit on the house for? So they leave.
Wow.
Butch Blassie clips him and leaves, throws the gun nearby, and then goes home and brags about it to everybody. I just killed Giancana. He told everybody. So it's not like it's a secret that he killed him, and he killed him on Ocado's orders. So, then they came into, did the CIA kill him? Well, look, no, the CIA didn't kill him. The mob did. Butch Blassie did. But did the CIA maybe order the federal surveillance to take a powder? I don't know. Maybe somebody called the squad car and says, you guys could leave, or, you're wanted back at headquarters. Your shift is over. Come in. I don't know. Obviously, there are a lot of things that the government may have done. I could go through the whole list of Secret Service errors that are too coincidental to overlook. I could go through the whole list of CIA things that are too coincidental to overlook, and two cars leaving the property at the same time while he gets clipped and then showing up later. Come on. Something's obviously wrong, right? So, did they kind of like wink nod to Ocado so that he could take care of this, this thorn in everyone's side? Maybe, because they didn't want him back in front of the committee either, chatting away. So,
Sure.
But they didn't do it, is the point I'm making. The mob did it. That's caused, Matt, don't forget this. This has caused the biggest amount of confusion over the last 60 years. The idiots in this country who go, the mob did it. No, the government did it. The mob's too stupid to do it. The government's too smart to do it. The mob did it. The government did it. They did it together. If you could get that through your head that they work together, half the problem is solved.
Yes.
That Oliver Stone made a whole film and he goes, oh, the mob's too stupid to do it or whatever. The mob did it, you idiot. Jim Garrison was in bed with Carlos Marcello. I go through that whole thing in my book as well.
I want to come back to that in just a second when we get to Marcello. But if I could, I've got a rebuttal. So I have people send me emails and when they take issue with something I said, or or they disagree or whatever. And I have a rebuttal from Randy Barnett, who is a fan of the show. And he's a law professor at Georgetown University. He wanted to let everyone know that Merchandise Mart in Chicago, I kind of made it sound like a department store. It's actually a big place where people rent out stalls to sell things. And in 1930, when it was first constructed, it was the largest building in the world. So that's just some context. And then also, he wanted me to lay out that Phyllis McGuire was a huge star, not just some random person. Like she was a massive star at the time. So that was a
I
big
agree.
deal, which underlines your point of kind of Giancana was out there. And then the last point, Dan Rowan, I wrongfully said that he was a musician or a singer. He's not a singer, he's a comedian.
That comedian.
So I wanted to correct the record on that. I want to move on to Johnny Roselli. We're getting into the the thick of it here. Roselli, Trafficante, then Marcello. So you said earlier that Roselli had done hits. I didn't realize that I thought he was more on the business side.
Oh no, he was a known killer. Absolutely.
Oh.
So he was friendly with this guy, Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano, who was from the Los Angeles mob. And they always stayed close. And Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano became an informant later in life and confessed to, I don't know how many murders, a lot, that he said, I garroted this guy, shot this guy, burned that guy, whatever. He killed a lot of people. And Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano, directly from him, he said that Johnny Roselli did a lot of work. He put in a lot of work. And work in the mob is meaning kill people, contracts.
Wow.
When they say somebody put in a lot of work, that means they killed a lot of people. And that came straight from Jimmy the Weasel Fradiano. So, and there's other reasons to believe that Roselli, he wasn't just welcomed into the Chicago mob and then sent as an ambassador to Las Vegas and eventually, originally in Hollywood, he was sent as an ambassador to Hollywood, then an ambassador to Las Vegas. There's a reason why you send that guy. One is he's good with diplomacy. He knows how to talk to people. And two is, if there's a problem, whether he's going to do it himself or he's going to get people to do it, he's going to take care of business. This is a day and age where, the mob is the mob. As I said, they kill. Now things have changed a lot, but they kill. So Roselli was known for work.
When Roselli testified to the HSCA, he made it clear that he wouldn't speak on Trafficante, and he made it clear that he was afraid for his safety regarding.
Oh, well, Roselli said basically that he did speak a little about Trafficante, which aggravated Trafficante. He spoke about him to the extent that he said he was sort of like the Spanish interpreter during the CIA Castro plot, CIA mob Castro plot.
Right.
But he stopped there. He never implicated him in the Kennedy assassination. But he did admit that Trafficante was sort of like the CIA interpreter. Trafficante was in Florida. He spoke fluent Italian and fluent Spanish, which both languages are very close, by the way. They're both of the Latin origins. So he was basically, kind of sort of saying Trafficante was involved with us during the Castro thing, but that's all I know. I don't know anything about Kennedy, and I can't say anything about Trafficante with regard to Kennedy.
Do you think Trafficante killed Roselli?
100%. Oh, that's a fact. Oh, 100%. So Roselli keeps getting called to these things that's unsettling to Trafficante. He's not happy that even Roselli's admitting he was an interpreter. First of all, that's like, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to, back then, especially omerta, the code, the silence, the whole thing was very live at the time. You don't go in front of a committee. When they say you know anything about it, I don't even know Trafficante. Trafficante who? I never met him. But we have a picture of you with him. Oh, it must have been a freak thing. I don't know who that guy is. That's the day and time we're talking about. And Roselli's going in front of the committees. And I think he had a couple of closed sessions too, where they weren't sure exactly what he said. And they're wondering. So, like, for example, I think Trafficante, when he was subpoenaed, said, I wanted to be in front of an open committee. He's telling all the mob bosses across the country who he's colleagues with, you're going to see and hear what I do. Nobody's going to try to pin some word or sentence or paragraph on me that I didn't say behind closed doors. That's sort of like, so, and he was very evasive, Trafficante was. And so Roselli now is getting on everybody's nerves. And, he shows up. He looks like a lobbyist from Washington. He's dressed to the nines. He's carrying an attache case. The news and media are following him. But at the same time, he's leaking stories to this guy,
Jack Anderson.
Jack Anderson. And, he's saying things that aren't supposed to come out. And Anderson's printing them. And everybody knows who's in the know that it's coming from Roselli. For example, if when I was active on the streets, I did heists and hijackings. So if I read an article and it says Lou Ferrante hijacked this truck on such and such a date with so-and-so, and I'm like, all right, there was 2 of us besides me on that day, but it says they just did it with that guy. Where's the other guy? He's the guy who's talking. Or I read my indictment and there's 4 of us on a hijacking and we know there's only 3 of us in the room. Where's the 4th guy? He's the rat. If you're in the know who it was, right? So the stories are being read by the mob and they're going, that's coming from Roselli. He's spitting it all out. When is it going to end? And he's terrified of being deported. That's what his motivation is, or going back to jail. He just did a small stint. So, and he's getting older. You don't want to go to jail. So they're worried that he's going to talk. So Trafficante specifically gets a permission because, once again, I had mentioned this earlier to you. You just can't kill somebody who's not from your Borgata. Trafficante could kill anybody from his family in Florida. He's the boss of that family. The boss is the father, the patriarch of a family. Just like you could, if you have children, up until recent times when no one's allowed to discipline their children physically, right? It's a different world now. But when I grew up, my father gave me a crack. That there was a different world. I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying this is what happened. So if you could discipline your children, but I can't, I'm your neighbor. Can I walk over and give your son a crack in the head and tell him get off my lawn? You would kill me if I did that. You would say, how dare you touch my son? I could discipline my son. You can't. Same thing with a mob family. Trafficante could kill anybody in his family, but he's got to get permission from Chicago to kill Roselli because Chicago owns Roselli. He's with the Chicago mob. So he sends word to Chicago and says, this guy don't shut up. I need to clip him. Chicago gives him the okay. This is in the book too, in my book, Clash of Titans. Chicago gives him the okay, and Trafficante has one of his soldiers. He goes out on the yacht one day, and it was kind of a sad story because he's older. They said, look, we threw a garrote around his neck, shoved a rag in his mouth, and he barely resisted. The guy was an older man, and he had emphysema, so he was already having trouble breathing, and he's schooled. He's killed how many people in his life? He knows it's done. No matter how hard you fight, you're going. And there's no way a frail man is going to beat up 2 or even 3 guys on a boat. It's over. So he just gave in. They killed him. And then they must have let him, I wrote this in the book too, they must have let him sit around for a little while because he was frail and small enough to be folded into the barrel that they threw him in, the drum. But they cut him in half, which means rigor mortis must have set in. And then, as I wrote in my book, they cut him in half for the same reason we break spaghetti, so it fits in the pot. They cut him in half and put him in the barrel. And then they didn't realize he'd rise to the top. They cut him open from navel to neck. But apparently there was some upper parts of his lungs because of the emphysema that had air pockets. And he floated to the top. He brought the whole barrel like a cork. And, had they not found him within a few days, it would have sunk to the bottom again, but it didn't. And basically, after that, one of the guys who was involved in the hit said, I carried it out. And he was a soldier for Trafficante. And then they picked up on a bug in Chicago, one of the bosses saying Trafficante had it and blew it, meaning the body was found. He didn't blow it, meaning he killed him. So he didn't blow to death, but they didn't want him found. They wanted him sunk to the bottom, disappeared. It looks like he left town. They left his car at an airport to make it look like he got on a plane. The mob used to leave people's cars at airports, so it looks like you took off on your own. And he used to say to people, if I'm ever missing, go to the airport, you'll see my car there. And sure enough, his brother-in-law the next day took a ride to the airport in Miami and found his car there parked.
Wow. All right, let's go on to that's very helpful. That's good context. Let's go on to Trafficante, and we've talked about him a lot here in general, but I do want to point out this the Jose Aleman conversation that was in September of 1962, and when we get to Marcello, there's a guy, Ed Becker, who talks about a similar confession from Marcello. You know what month and year that was? September of 1962, the same time. So, so that just kind of underlines the Jose Aleman conversation we were having earlier. Let me ask you this: Have you heard of Danny Sheehan? You know who Danny Sheehan is?
Lawyer, writer, I think.
Lawyer. He's the guy who worked for F. Lee Bailey. And
I met F. Lee Bailey on a visit. I was on a visit with Joe Watts was one of the gunmen. Joe Watts was a big mobster under John Gotti, and he was a dear friend of mine. Yeah, when I was in jail with Joe Watts had F. Lee Bailey, and F. Lee Bailey came up on a visit once, so I had a nice conversation with him. I mean, it was like talking to an icon. You know, he'd been around so long. He'd had so many big cases. I was also represented by William Kunstler, so I had the good fortune of being around some big attorneys in my time. Sure. And by the way, your friend Randy, shout out to him. Hello. We know who he is, a legendary attorney. So
cool.
Go ahead.
So Danny Sheehan was an associate at F. Lee Bailey's law firm during the Watergate situation, and they represented James McCord, the F. Lee Bailey did. And we kind of laid it out in one of the episodes, and he's actually got an interview with Julian Dory and a few other ones where
Julian Dory is great, by the way. I can't say enough good things about him. All your viewers, listeners, please subscribe to Julian Dory. He's phenomenal. Yeah,
I'm a fan of Julian's for sure.
Oh, he's huge. He's great.
So Sheehan basically says that their lead investigator, this guy Andy Tooney, went down to interview Trafficante. Because Trafficante was a client of the firm, and F. Lee Bailey represented Trafficante too. And while he was talking to him, Trafficante laid out this scenario. It was related to Watergate because of a check that was in McCord's pocket, and that check went back to the Banco Internacional in Mexico City, and supposedly the same check that paid the Watergate burglars came from the bank account that was used to fund Cuban exiles, supposedly. Okay, this is what Sheehan says Trafficante told their investigator. So the bottom line is, Sheehan says Trafficante said, "Look, I put together the team that killed Kennedy, but I did it to kill Castro, and then it ended up being something different. But I'm the one that helped put the team together." Have you ever looked at that, or is that consistent with?
Yeah. So I believe that, once again, to rewind a little, at first, Trafficante did not want to remove Castro.
Right.
At some point when he was involved in the CIA-Mafia plot to kill Castro, I believe that he was working as a double agent. And a lot of evidence came forward. And by the way, Bill Harvey suspected him of being a double agent. Bill Harvey would curse Trafficante to Roselli, because he didn't believe Trafficante was putting his best efforts into killing Castro, and he couldn't figure out why. So he believed he was a double agent. That said, at some point or another, I think Trafficante and Marcello realized that they had to get rid of Kennedy or they were going to go. Bobby had this attitude where it's you or me. Bobby was ruthless. He was a Savonarola of, the Justice Department. He was, like a Jesuit monk. He's going to, he's very idealistic. He's going to get you. And he's going to stop at nothing to destroy you. And they knew that it was us or him. And he was not only indicting Marcello, but he had Marcello's wife subpoenaed. He seized their bank accounts. The wife is crying every day. The kids are crying. Are we going to lose our father? He dumped them in the Guatemalan jungles, Marcello. He's doing the same thing to Trafficante. He's torturing him. So they felt like we have to get rid of them. Now, the mob's goal, as I said, there may be different motivations when conspiracies take place. You can't say everybody has the same motivation. When it's a large conspiracy, if you think everybody's motivated by the same exact thing, you're gonna ruin your whole investigation. You have to think that people may want different things out of it. So Marcello and Trafficante just want to stop Bobby from destroying them. That's their goal. And the rest of the mob now is in on it too. They're like, you know what, whatever you do, because not that they're bringing the rest of the mob in on it, but he's got to go, Kennedy, or he's going to destroy us all. So whatever you do. They're not interested. They know that they got it covered. At some point or another, though, the governments, I believe, any rogue CIA agents who were involved, their goal is to make it look like Castro killed Kennedy, so that the United States, the American public, demands an invasion of Cuba. That's my opinion on that, and I state why. When Ruby was arrested, Jack Ruby, who owns Topless Clubs, is in the precinct, and he goes, now we're gonna go into Cuba. We'll invade now. That's an awfully astute observation, geopolitical observation for the owner of a booby bar. I mean, come on, right?
Yeah.
A little too much. Isn't that a little over his head? But no, not quite. So I believe that the government's motivation is Cold War. Kennedy's selling us out. We got to stop them. We need to stop Cuba, the spread of communism, the domino effect. If we let it continue in Cuba, it'll go sweep across South and Central America. Then what do? Then it's right at our doorsteps. Then Mexico. What do? It'll be just us in Canada versus the rest of the everything that's within the Monroe Doctrine. So we can't let it happen. So basically, they want to stop Kennedy and get him out of office for their own reasons, geopolitical reasons that have to do with, involved with, by the way, any rogue CIA agents. Don't think they're treacherously killing Kennedy because they hate America. They think in their heads they're patriotic Americans, and Kennedy is the one treacherously selling out America, just to keep that clear. I'm not saying that they are. They have no right to kill a president who's elected by the American people. I'm telling you, this is what they think at the time, to give you their mindset. Where does Trafficante fit into this? Trafficante is down with all of the Cuban exiles who were trained by the CIA as marksmen. So there's evidence. Roselli had said, I think to Jack Anderson at one point, that Trafficante sent the shooters. He believed Trafficante sent the shooters, being Cubans. So now let's go with that and say, was Roselli telling the truth? Did Trafficante send some of the shooters? Now, who were the shooters? We don't know. I don't know. I didn't try to get into that in my book either. Was Woody Harrelson's father there? He might have been. Were there Cubans seen in the windows? There were dark-skinned guys seen in the book Depository who were in Oswald. There might have been Cubans. But there's another piece of evidence that we should keep in mind. When Rose Cherami was beat up and thrown out of the car and picked up by Louisiana officer Fruge, she said they're going to kill Kennedy. This is prior to she's a topless dancer / prostitute at the time, working woman, who says they're going to kill Kennedy. These guys who were driving with me said, we're on our way to drop off drugs, drop you off, and then go kill Kennedy. She goes, they said, who are they? They were Italians. Now, they were apparently dropping off drugs, and they left Florida and they're heading to Dallas. Who are these guys that she thinks are Italians doing a drug run between Florida and Texas? Well, Trafficante is the one sending drugs all over the country because he's getting it in through Miami, just like in the 1980s, right? Miami Vice times, drugs was still coming through everything in Miami. So back then, especially, Trafficante is controlling all that and then disperses it throughout the country. So these guys are making a drug run. Were they really Italians? They could have been, but they could also have been Cubans, and she didn't know any better because I knew a lot of Cubans that I couldn't tell from Italians that were born in Cuba. FBI agent Jack Garcia, who's a friend of mine, a retired agent now, he went undercover in the Gambino crime family as an Italian mobster. He was born and raised in Cuba. He speaks Spanish fluently. Born and raised in Cuba, went undercover as an Italian. So there's plenty of Cubans who you can't tell from an Italian. They're darker skinned. They got the talk, the walk, the whole thing. There's a lot of them. So did she mistake those Cubans and were they Cubans if they were sent by Trafficante? Were they really Cuban shooters who were sent by Trafficante? We don't know. I didn't talk about it. I never said anything definitively if I couldn't prove it in my books. And once again, if I make a mistake throughout this entire podcast, keep in mind that I don't have my reference notes in front of me. Yeah, I'm working from memory. But if you read my book and I have time to put the exact reference note, you flip to the back, you could see it. Yeah.
You're going off the dome. And one thing I really like about you, Lou, is that you're versed in the granular details and like everything you're saying. You're like, yo, I have it. I've got the receipts. But you're, for lack of a better term, like not nerdy. Like you're like a cool guy to talk to. So and you've actually had some life experiences. So
I'm actually pretty nerdy inside. I wasn't years ago. I am now.
Yeah, right. Anyway, so yeah, man, if you're ever in Columbus, Ohio, hit me up. We'll grab a drink.
Thanks, brother. I look forward to it.
But all right, we got to hit on Marcello and then wrap up real quick. So,
okay.
All right, Carlos Marcello. So, just high level. Obviously, he's the boss of Louisiana. Texas is part of that. And $1.1 billion a year is how much he brought in 1963. In 1963 money.
Cited by not only publications that have published that figure, but that came directly from the head of the crime commission there, Aaron Cohn or something
Aaron
like
Cohn,
that.
Head of the New Orleans Metropolitan Crime Commission.
There you go. That's correct. Yep.
That's right.
So this is, and he thoroughly looked into them too. He didn't just throw that figure out, from what I understand.
Right. Marcello had underbosses in Dallas, Joe Savello and Joe Campisi, both of whom were really close to Jack Ruby. Now, we're not going to really talk much on Ruby in this podcast, because the next one I'm doing is dedicated to just Ruby. But really, on the Marcello side of things, there's two potential angles that I'm looking at, and one is, did Marcello quarterback Ruby killing Oswald? Was Marcello sort of the...
He did more than that, I'll tell you right now. So
and then the assassination itself. But yeah, go ahead.
So everybody, the people who are willing to admit that the mob had a hand in it, will usually stop at the point where, yes, Marcello controlled Ruby and Ruby did the shooting, silenced Oswald. It was a favor the mob did for, the government conspirators. And that's it. If you do a deep dive, it's much deeper than that. Once again, I urge everybody to read my book. I'm not trying to plug books. 10 people might buy it. I don't get any money for it. Enjoy the book. I get $1 a copy. $10 ain't going to make or break me. I want you to read it because I want you to understand the story and where it came from. Marcello is in Louisiana. All of the main conspirators are coming out of the New Orleans area. Marcello controls New Orleans, okay? Controls it. Controls not only the underworld in New Orleans, but he has donated the majority to the campaigns for governor, for mayor, for the state prosecutor, for the local prosecutor. He's controlling all of the state government. And I go through all of the sources and all of the references where this comes out, where he's in complete control of the political machine in Louisiana. There's nothing he doesn't control. So everybody is in there. Who's there? Who's in Louisiana? Okay. Oswald hangs out at the office. Oswald starts palling around with David Ferrie. David Ferrie, in my opinion, is the hub of the conspiracy. Never forget that. Marcello is funding the conspiracy. Okay, when Kennedy, let me give you the idea of where Marcello is. David Ferrie, all evidence points to him as the hub of the conspiracy. He's in touch with the mob, he's in touch with the CIA, and he's in touch with the exiles. He's sitting there right in the middle. And everything's revolving around David Ferrie. David Ferrie is close with Marcello. David Ferrie is also close with Oswald, and both of them are close with Guy Bannister. Now, it's tough to go through all these names. I think the people who are listening to this will know who they are. But this is the first time, if I was able to contribute anything to this assassination that's new, because a lot of it's been out there, I just pulled the pieces together and wrote my own story as best I could. I'm not going to say I cracked the investigation. This has been done by people who came before me that worked their fingers to the bone, trying to get stuff released, documents released, FOIA requests, digging, tooth and nail to get things. They are responsible for bringing the evidence out. I put the story together in my book, and I think I did a good job of that. But if I'm able to bring anything new to the table, this was it. When Kennedy had to strike a deal with Khrushchev during the missile crisis, he said, you pull the missiles out of, Khrushchev said, you pull the missiles out of Turkey and I'll pull the missiles out of Cuba. That didn't come out till years later. But Kennedy also promised Khrushchev that he would never invade Cuba again like he did during the Bay of Pigs. And Khrushchev wanted that promise because he said, there's no way they would botch it up as bad as they did the first time, the US government. And they blew it because they left the exiles on the beaches by themselves and wouldn't back them up, which was blamed on Kennedy. That, and was Kennedy's fault, by the way. I gave Kennedy a pass for the missile crisis because we're on the brink of nuclear holocaust. Nobody knows what could happen. If there's a 1% chance, I would have went in, but if there's a 1% chance, maybe I'm a little more daring than Kennedy. Maybe he did the right thing. We'll never know. But during the Bay of Pigs, I think he should have helped those Cuban exiles. We trained them. We dumped them on the beaches. We should have followed through and helped them. You can't leave them stranded on the beaches. Everybody blamed him for that. So during the missile crisis, Kennedy says, okay, to Khrushchev, we will not invade Cuba again. We will not try. And this is a promise he makes to Khrushchev. So what does he do to follow through on that promise? He immediately defunds the program Mongoose that's fueling the sabotage missions, the conspiracies, etc., to topple Castro and to take back Cuba. He defunds them. So the 100 or 200 million that they've spent, and we'll never know how much it was, immediately goes to zero overnight. Now, the CIA, if they want to continue, they're strapped for funds. Nobody's ever brought this up but me. I pat myself on the back for just this alone, if I could say I contributed anything to this. They're strapped for funds. There's no more funding. Where are they going to go? Don't forget Estes Kefalva. He said the mafia is a government within the government. So when the first government defunded the exiles and the CIA no longer has money to fund anything against Cuba, or maybe against Kennedy at that point, where are they going to go? To the second government. Carlos Marcello, as you said, is doing $1.1 billion a year, which is more than small countries in either Eastern Europe or South America. He's doing more than their GDP. Carlos Marcello, one man in Louisiana, he's got all the money in the world to fund a conspiracy if he wants to. They went to him for money. Suddenly, when Ferrie meets Marcello, he goes from being broke all the time to passing around crisp $100 bills to everybody who needs money. And all this, and it's proven that Marcello was funding the exiles in the beginning, which was a patriotic thing to do because the government wanted to take back Cuba. But after the government defunded the exile mission to take back Cuba, Marcello continues to fund the exiles. Why is he funding them now if he's changed course with the American government's policy, the Kennedy administration's policy? He's funding them because he wants something different. What does he want? The question is obvious. The answer is obvious, rather. So he begins to fund the exiles. He begins to fund even the CIA, I think, the rogue CIA agents. Now, let me tell you, how do you fund them? What money do they need? I'm going to tell you a guy. If you go online, you'll see pictures of me, surveillance photos of me in California. I'm about to pull a heist. I'm about to knock off an armored truck in California. And the FBI is following me. They're watching me meeting with my crew. They're watching me going back and forth at the hotel. I'm from New York. It costs money to bring an entire crew to California and do a heist. I'm funding that. I'm considered the guy who's later on, I was charged with being the quote unquote hub of the conspiracy, the mastermind. I'm funding it, right? I'm the leader of the crew. These guys need plane tickets. These guys need hotels. These guys have to be fed 3 times a day. These guys need beers at night when they sit on the lanai or the deck or whatever. These guys need cab fare. These guys need pocket money. These guys need guns. They need scanners. They need two-way radios. And they need everything else that goes with all of us getting on planes and going to California to pull off an army car heist. So the FBI pulls the plug on that. I'm 5-10 grand short. I'm out. I'm out my money. And that was back in 1990. I'm out 10 grand. And that's just for a little heist with 4 guys. What do you think Dealey Plaza cost?
Sure.
What do you think, right? Think about that. You're putting all guys, you're giving them $1 million a piece, maybe, the shooters. You're putting them behind the grassy knoll. You're putting them up in the book depository and maybe even in the Daltex building where, what's his name, was spotted and caught. Braiding spotted in there. What do you think an operation like that costs and who's going to pay for it? Nobody ever talks about that. The CIA isn't paying for that. They went to Marcello.
Interesting.
That's who's paying for it. And all of the writing is on the wall.
I have a question for you on the Ruby side of things before we get into the Kennedy side. There's H.L. Hunt, right? The big oil billionaire.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a right-hand man named John Curington. That was his executive assistant. And Curington really was his executive assistant. He was there. There's lawsuits involving him, so he's definitively telling the truth about that. But he came out with a book in like 2017, and it wasn't a very big book at all. It was very little fanfare. And one of the parts of the book, he talks about H.L. Hunt asking him to go down to the police department and scope out the security on Ruby, and then H.L. Hunt asking him to contact Joe Savello to set up a meeting at Hunt's house at 6 a.m. on the Sunday morning where Ruby
how about this, Matt? Prior to the assassination, Ruby visits the offices of Hunt, and prior to the assassination, Brading, who we just mentioned, visits the offices of H.L. Hunt. So go ahead, Matt.
I know. My question to you is, does that sound possible, or like what Curington said? Does that sound like
yes? So
like H.L. Hunt could be a funder in some regard, or he may have some.
Let me say what I think about all of that. So I believe Marcello is the main funder of the conspiracy. I believe that, and he's funneling the money through Ferrie, who then distributes it to whoever the co-conspirators are, whether it be CIA, whether it be Exiles, whether it be Oswald, whether it be Ruby. Ferrie, I think, is the sort of the chancellor of the exchequer, the secretary of the treasury for Marcello, right? So now that said, where does Hunt come in? I kept coming across Hunt, and I did not have enough to point the finger at him. So I kind of just mentioned him and moved on because I did not have the evidence. I did not have a preponderance of evidence like I do against Marcello, like I do against Ferrie, to make it part of the like you have to think if you're a prosecutor, I'm prosecuting a case, and I'm trying to prove to my reader, this is what happened. A prosecutor would be an idiot to throw out things and people that they can't back it, because then the defense is going to come in and go, what do you mean? H.L. Hunt didn't do that. H.L. You're going to look like you're lying about everything. So I had to know that, look, I don't have the goods on H.L. Hunt, and I'm going to open myself up to a lot of criticism if I point the finger at him. Having said that, let's talk about H.L. Hunt for a minute. This is not what I'm putting in a book. This is us having a casual conversation. Yeah. People hopefully are open-minded enough to listen and say, look, we're just shooting the breeze with you. We're not saying it's etched in gold, etched in stone. H.L. Hunt is friends with Lyndon Johnson. When Lyndon Johnson is offered the bottom half of the ticket after he loses to Kennedy during the primary, H.L. Hunt pushes. Johnson was always a leader. I read the multi-part biography. It's back here somewhere on my shelves. That genius wrote, Robert Caro. Absolute brilliant writer, multi-volume. I recommend it to anybody. He wrote excellent biography, 4, I think it's up to 5 volumes now. I read 4. I think the 5th might be coming out of Johnson. Robert Caro tells you Johnson was always a leader. He never wanted to play second fiddle to anybody. He was quote unquote master of the Senate, which is one of the volumes Caro named, I think, master of the Senate. So why does Johnson accept the bottom half of the ticket and knowing he's going to be kowtowing to Kennedy for 4 years? Well, obviously you say, oh, he wants to be president. I don't know about that. H.L. Hunt was nudging him to accept it. And H.L. Hunt kept telling Kennedy, and there's evidence to state this, anything could happen. You never know. You're a step away, a breath away from the presidency. Grab it, take it, grab it. And he listens to H.L. Hunt because H.L. Hunt's the big man in Texas. At the time, he was worth over $700 million, which in today's currency might be how many billions, we don't even know. But he owned like, I don't know how many oil wells. So H.L. Hunt, and this guy, by the way, used to bring his lunch to work in a brown paper bag. You know, he had an apple and a yogurt or something, or an apple and an oatmeal, whatever it was. You know, he was like totally like, you know, he lived like a Puritan. But H.L. Hunt wanted Johnson to take the bottom half of the ticket. And he knows that. Now, at some point or another, there's a lot of talk that Marcello funded Johnson in Texas, a lot of campaigns, as did H.L. Hunt, right? But Marcello's funding Johnson too. What is Johnson doing in return for that campaign funding? Well, evidence came out that he's killing anti-rackets, anti-gambling legislation in committee before it hits the floor. Killing it, you know, off the bat, which is part of his $1.1 billion empire a year is gambling. So Johnson's making sure that Marcello's gambling empire continues to strive by helping him through killing legislation. And it later came out, all of this. So now Johnson also, don't forget, Johnson, who I couldn't point the finger at definitively either, but there's a lot of evidence pointing towards Johnson as being very suspicious. So Johnson is friends with H.L. Hunt. H.L. Hunt looks like he's meeting all of the wrong people at the wrong time. So there's something going on, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what and what his role was. So I had to just mention him and get in and out, because if I don't have the evidence, I don't want to throw it out there and look like a quote unquote crazy conspiracy theorist. You know, I mean, you're going to get that label quick. I'm going to get it anyway, even with the evidence. But
that's kind of where I am on Johnson and on H.L. Hunt as well. A couple other things that I want to bring up about Marcello. So September 1962, this is when there's the Ed Becker confession, the whole thing about if you cut the tail off the dog, that's one thing, but if you cut the head off the dog will die. It's the same month that Trafficante told Jose Aleman that JFK would be hit. Then you got Eugene de la Parra, March of 1963.
Talking to Ben, what's his
Ferrie.
name? Yeah. No, he's talking to Ben something who was in bed with Marcello too, and then Ferrie.
Right. Yes. Talking about JFK being hit when he comes down south. And then for Marcello, there is the question of the mechanics of how he could have possibly done it if he was the spark that lit the thing. Okay.
The Wizard of Oz. He's got the money.
Well, yeah, but I'll talk about the details about that in just a little bit. But my question is CAMTEX, the operation where they, wanted to see is Marcello still operating his crime family out of prison, and they're recruiting.
Brit Lab?
Yeah. That's right. That was the operation that got him in prison. And then once he's there, they run this op called CAMTEX.
Oh, right, inside prison. When the inmate takes him.
Van Lanningham.
Right.
Jack Van Lanningham, I believe his name
Correct.
was. And long story short, Van Lanningham talks about all these confessions that Marcello made.
Where are they? Why don't they give them to us?
But exactly, they're still, we're supposed to have on tapes. Marcello,
I'm going to tell you right now, the fact that they won't give them to us tells us everything we need to know. Because if there wasn't shit on them, you'd have them.
Yeah.
That's it.
Exactly. And so, but if assuming the tapes support what Van Lanningham said, and given that he knew there were tapes, I would imagine so. Yeah. Marcello laid out to him that, hey, actually, we controlled the Carousel Club. Ruby was just a manager. He was skimming from us, unbeknownst to us. And so I called him to Churchill Farms and told him, what was up, and that he owed me a favor. And Marcello didn't explicitly spell out to Van Lanningham, and thus the favor that I cashed in was him killing Oswald. But he said
completely believable. What you said that's exactly how a mob works. You got a guy by the balls. His life's on the line. You could pretty much cash in on anything with the guy.
Exactly.
The star's the limit. What do you want from him?
Right. No, exactly. So that's so to me, there is really strong evidence against Marcello. Here's where I get into questions for Marcello. And it really, because I could see Marcello, he's funding the operation. We know he's funding Sergio Arcacha Smith's Cuban Council, you alluded to. And we know that he's got close relationship with Trafficante. Now, I couldn't find any hard evidence that he had business interest in Cuba, but I imagine he's got to have.
No, absolutely. So Marcello was one of the investors with Meyer Lansky when they took over Cuba. So Marcello wasn't going to pass up that opportunity, and Lansky was known for sharing. Lansky was like the kind of guy, he went to all the bosses. He says, whoever wants in, this is what you give us, and this is what you get. They replicated that in one of the Godfather movies when they sit around the table and, the gold phone and the whole thing. But Lansky went to all the bosses. He wouldn't have never left out Marcello, and Marcello would have never passed on that. So Marcello also wanted to not only have gambling in Cuba, but he had a tomato canning company that supplied the U.S. Navy.
Right.
He wanted to do something with Cuba with his tomatoes too, and other things. It's a country.
So here's my question. And I think this is my challenge with the Carlos Marcello as the main sort of spark, because everything we've laid out, you and I are in agreement about the fact. Yeah. Okay. But the thing is, you got the autopsy, which if there's a conspiracy, the autopsy had to be fraudulent. Like that's a prerequisite,
Correct.
right?
100%.
So
That's
that
part of the cover-up.
right, but that means all I'm saying is it seems like it would be easier for someone in the government to be the match that strikes it because they're going to know that.
Well, let me break it down for you like this. So I'm never discounting the fact that the government is involved all along.
Right.
So I've said that time and time again. And if we lose sight of it, and a lot of people will go, well, Marcello couldn't do the autopsy, so he couldn't be involved. Or Marcello couldn't have manipulated the Secret Service to make that turn on Elm Street. Only that could have to come from, couldn't have been involved, right? Or Marcello couldn't make the decision to walk Oswald through the basement when Ruby gets him. So he couldn't have. They're working together. So don't lose sight of that. They're working together. Now, part two of what I just said, part two is, don't confuse what happens during the cover-up part, the post-assassination, with what happens in the beginning. So as I say in my book, at one point or another after the assassination, Marcello must have known this. If they investigate this, I'm in bed with the CIA. I'm in bed with William Harvey and all kinds of people that are involved on the highest levels, maybe even Dulles, we don't know. Maybe even Angleton, we don't know. Maybe even, what's his name? I read his memoir, Helms.
Yeah.
Maybe Helms. We don't know. But he's in bed with the CIA, so he knows. This ain't going nowhere, this investigation. If I was in the mob, and I'm going to hit an army car, like I said, in California. Remember I told you that? Okay, now I'm going to hit it. They got surveillance photos of me there. If I was in bed with the head of the CIA or 5 CIA agents, and they told me, Lou, rob the army car, we need that money, and we're going to take it, and we're going to give it to the Contras in Nicaragua. I could go to California and go, hey, it's me. I'm about to rob an army car. Who cares? Who's going to arrest me? I'm with the CIA. You can't touch me. You understand? So Marcello knows no matter what happens afterwards, he's going to be cleared. They ain't coming after him. And then who's going to be president? Johnson. You think Johnson is going to order a forensic accounting of Marcello and watch all of the campaign contributions that went to Johnson in Texas for 2 decades? Never happened. Marcello knows that he's going to get away with this. So that's first of all. But then part of the cover-up, the autopsy, right? Once they go into cover-up mode, that's out of Marcello's hands. These guys are covering that up on their own. Hoover's doing a massive cover-up right away. He says Oswald, contrary to all the information he has on his desk, Hoover, he says Oswald's a lone nut. Then he says Ruby's a lone nut. So if somebody would have killed Ruby, Hoover would have said, we got a third lone nut. And until the lone nuts keep piling up in the Dallas morgue. Right. What the hell is going on, right? So they're covering it up. Don't forget that. Don't confuse that. How about the Secret Service? Somebody makes a last-minute decision to have that car, the limousine, make that sharp turn, and eventually go onto Elm Street right in front of the grassy knoll. Who makes that decision? Secret Service agent Forrest Searles. No, Forrest Searles first. Right. Where does Searles get the command from? Back in Washington from Gerald Behn. Right. And why does Gerald Behn? A little interesting thing. Gerald Behn always sat in the front seat with Kennedy on every motorcade up until Dallas. All of a sudden, Gerald Behn goes, I'm taking a vacation. I'm not going to Dallas. Wait, what do you mean you're taking a vacation? You're going to miss Dallas? It's the biggest motorcade we've had. The most likely of a problem being in Dallas because that's where all the crazy people are. And they hit, what's his name, over the head with a sign. The ambassador. Adelaide Stevenson, ambassador to UN, over the head with a sign. We need you in that. I'm taking a vacation. See you guys later. I'm going home. Right. Arrivederci. Then all of a sudden he decides in the midst of his vacation, I'm going to go back to the White House, to the East Wing, West Wing, wherever the hell he was running his office. I think I'm going to work anyway, but I'll do it from the office. And then he's picking up the phone and calling shots from Washington going, we don't want a lot of agents crowding Kennedy around the car. They're like, what are you talking about? Yeah, we don't want agents too on the back steps. Tell them not to stand on those back steps on the back of the rear bumper. We don't. What do you mean? Those are guys that would obstruct a shot from behind. You don't want them on the back step? Yeah, get them off the back step. Tell them not to crowd Kennedy too much and make sure they make this turn on Elm Street too. Yeah. And guys are going, the Secret Service is going, wasn't Behn supposed to be on vacation? So can the mob control Behn? Obviously not. So who does? Somebody on a level with Dulles or Dulles himself or somebody up there is obviously calling Behn and telling, we need these last minute changes to the motorcade route so this thing could happen. Or we just need them. Don't worry about why. Don't ask questions.
Yeah.
Okay. So that, don't confuse that. So never confuse where people will go, well, if Bain's calling the shots from Washington, surely Marcello and Trafficante can't control Behn. I agree. But they're not in bed with just mobsters. They're not just dealing with two-bit hoodlums with 38 calibers. They're working with the CIA.
For me, the way that you are phrasing it is the way that the mafia could have done it.
It's the only way.
So,
well, don't forget, they didn't do it alone, though. They had help. Yeah, they're working with, yeah.
Just so you know, the way my show works is I cover one topic and I go super duper in depth, but I don't even look at future topics until I get to
Got
it.
it.
So I haven't, season 1 was all the basic evidence. Season 2 is we zoomed into Oswald's life. Season 3 is, okay, well, who did it? And we went deep on Secret Service, confirmed everything you said. It went deep on J. Edgar Hoover. Everything that you said is also what we found. Went deep on LBJ, very deep. And same thing you said. Like I was able to, now look, this is disputed and some people in the audience will continue to disagree with me, but Mac Wallace and the guys that people are usually associated with, being awesome. LBJ's instrumentality of who did the killing. I just, I didn't buy that, but LBJ had other issues.
I don't have Mac Wallace in Dallas, but I do have, and he could have been, I'm just saying, I can't say he was there. However, there's a lot of evidence that came from Billy Solestes that Mac Wallace was killing people to silence people who were involved with Johnson's conspiracies having to do with Washington and Texas.
True,
so,
that's true. The 1984, we zoomed in all that, but so anyway, I say that to say I have not. So I'm just now wrapping up the Mafia, and this has been incredible for me because I really didn't know how all this stuff worked together. I didn't, but it turns out it's not the Mafia at large. We're talking about Marcello and Trafficante and a little bit of Giancana and some Roselli, really.
Yeah.
And working with other entities. And so I've yet to cover the Cuban exiles at all. We haven't covered them at all. I haven't covered Cuba as a culprit, like Castro. I don't think Castro did it, but that's obviously one of the culprits. Soviet Union. I gotta get to the CIA generals. So, but at any rate, I have one last question for you. And I didn't bring this up before, but I just want just off the dome. James Files. People keep asking me about James.
I don't know. I listened to him. I read. I don't know. Yeah. I have no idea.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I've been emailed. People have emailed me through my website. LouisFerrante.com is my website. Anybody who reads my books, by the way, feel free to drop me a line. If you have an issue with anything I've said, let me know. Give me your thoughts. I'm open. I'm a historian. This is a moving piece. These are moving pieces. We try our best to figure out what happened. If you have input, feel free. If I can't get back to you, I will. Sometimes I'm busy. But James Files, I've had people email me and say, well, James Files, don't you believe he did it? Don't you think I don't know. I don't know who the shooters were on the ground. We're never going to know who was behind the grassy knoll, who was in the book depository, and who may have been in the Valtex building taking shots. We don't know, but yeah.
I didn't look at James Files or even address him. And I probably should have, just in the context of the Mafia. But candidly, none of the researchers I respect give him any credence at all.
I didn't either. I didn't even mention him in my book. I didn't even mention him. Like I said, the first I started to get a lot of people emailing me going, why don't you think it's him? I did not even mention James Files because I had nothing to substantiate his his admittance with. So, I felt like anybody could come forward and say, I took a shot. I was here. I was there. Look, did he? Who the hell knows? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it wasn't enough for me to even consider him.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I was just curious if you had, because if your perspective was, no, you should actually take a look at James Files. That would be interesting.
I'll be honest with you. The closest I came to somebody saying they didn't do it, who I think did, was Charles Harrelson. And the reason why I'll say that is because, and you could argue whether that was him in the picture, the hobos or not, whatever the case is. I base my strongest evidence on the fact that at one point he was drunk or high, he was being arrested, he got into a standoff with the cops, and he admitted everything and said that I was one of the shooters, etc. And then later when he sobered up, he said, I was lying. That was all a lie. I didn't. And we all know that people tell the truth when they're drunk. You know, if a friend tells you, look, I hated you since high school, when he's drunk. I hated you since high school. I've always been jealous of you. I wish you weren't a lawyer. I hate lawyers too. I never made it as big as you. All I am is whatever. I don't want to do a menial job, but I never made it as big as you, and I hate you, and I'm jealous because he's drunk. But the next morning he says to you, I was just joking. I love you. I love you. I love you. Which one are you going to believe? You're going to believe he's drunk. Stalin used to have Politburo get-togethers after their meetings. The whole Politburo used to attend his little parties at night where he'd play music and get everybody drunk late into the night because all the truth slipped out then. Sure. And the next thing you know, the guy's marked for death the next day because he slipped and said something he shouldn't have said when he was drunk. Even when the Germans were visiting Stalin, the German delegation, I think von Ribbentrop with his assistants were visiting Stalin on the eve of war, and they're passing around a flask and they're all getting drunk and they're all talking. And the German runs out of alcohol and he grabs Stalin's flask and takes a swig. It's water. Stalin never even drink. He just listened to everybody else who was drunk. So I believe Woody Harrelson had made a somewhat of a truthful admission to some extent. And also, too, the other thing, don't forget, Charles Harrelson, not Woody. I believe also Charles Harrelson, what does he go to jail for life for? Shooting a judge. What did he shoot the judge with? Gee whiz, a high-powered rifle. Not something hitmen ordinarily use unless you're used to using them and this is what you do. So there's a couple of things, and I still didn't commit to Charles Harrelson. But, but those things stick out in my mind as if I were to have to say one way or another, who out of all the suspects we've heard about in Dealey Plaza, who would I think could have been there? I would probably say there's a possibility Charles Harrelson, just from those two things that I just explained to you. And I'm not sure. He might not have been. But I'm telling you that there's a possibility, besides maybe Cuban exiles who were trained by the CIA to use high-powered rifles.
Right. And Braden, whatever you
want. Braden was pulled out. Braden was caught in the Daltex building. Right, we know Braden was there. Right. Did Braden fire a shot or just organize it? Maybe he had a radio. We don't know, but he was in the Daltex building. So we know he was there for that. Yeah.
Well, hey, Lou Ferrante, you're one of a kind, man. You're an interesting dude. You're fun to talk to, and you're writing these books that are well sourced and cited. So I'm looking forward to getting them on my shelf, man. As soon as I hang up the Zoom here, I'm gonna go to Amazon.
Sounds good.
Appreciate you, man.
Yep. Thanks for having me. And once again, anybody who has any questions, reads the books, wants to ask me anything, shoot me an email through my website, louisferrante.com. I will get around to it. Sometimes it takes a couple of weeks, even if I'm busy, but I will get around to answering. And thank you for having me, Matt. I appreciate it.
Solving JFK listeners, we'll be back next week with a recap and rebuttals episode exclusively on Jack Ruby. Thanks a lot.